Good. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. Hope you've all enjoyed your day so far. We've heard some interesting feedback so far on some of the innovations that are continuing to be made across open infrastructure. We've probably been to this event the last 3 or 4 years. We find that the Nordics, especially, is an incredibly innovative territory. We get some great feedback from this event, so I hope you're all sharing that experience. My name is Mooney. I look after Whitebox and OEM server at Exertis Hammer. We've come here today really probably with a slightly different perspective to most of the talks you've already heard. So we have I'll give you a brief introduction, but we have a relatively large-scale business, predominantly built around hardware, so probably quite different to some of the other talks you've heard today. For those of you that don't know Exertis Hammer, we're part of a group called DCC, so headquarters in Ireland, currently turnover around £14 billion, so in terms of scale, relatively large. Most of that is irrelevant for you. DCC is essentially an investment vehicle with businesses throughout healthcare, throughout oil and gas, but importantly in technology. So Exertis as a brand is the branding for our technology business throughout EMEA. We have a diverse footprint around multiple countries in EMEA territory, including an office here in Sweden, headquarters out in the UK. And we wanted to come here today and talk to you about some of the challenges that we've seen for our customers who are looking to deploy open source. In terms of resources, we've seen huge developments in skills around OpenStack, around software-defined storage, around software-defined networking. And we thought we'd bring a different perspective in terms of how are those customers managing the complexity around deploying hardware for these environments. We'll give you a very quick overview of Hammer's business, a couple of case study examples of where we've been engaged with these types of customers, just to give you a bit of context around why we want to have this conversation with you. And then I'll introduce you to a couple of our vendors who have kindly joined today to give you some outside perspective. So in terms of Hammer, as part of Exertis' business, we've got a relatively narrow portfolio, as you can see from the screen. Currently have around 40 vendors, so in comparison to most traditional distribution type companies, it's very, very small. And the reason for that is we like to retain focus in complementary areas. So you'll see from the screen, vendors like Supermicro, Intel are complemented by vendors like Mellanox and Western Digital in terms of component level choice. And we do that for a number of reasons, which we'll touch on briefly. 6 of the key things which we hold on to at Hammer in terms of how we engage with our customers, of how we like to take product to market, of the types of discussions we like to have with our vendors. Innovation is obviously incredibly important in the industry we work in. We're seeing that open source is bringing very, very fast levels of innovation. The hardware vendors are responding by bringing new products to market faster than ever. So how do we remove some of the complexity about taking these into our data centers? Deploying applications on hardware that's maybe not been tested by anybody else. It's always been a challenge for us. So we like to stay on top of that level of innovation. In terms of application, all of our sales teams, all of our technical specialists are trained on application first. So we take an agnostic view towards hardware. We look at the application, the problems around deployment, around performance, and we look at how we address it best with the products we have available. And to enable us to do that, we've got product experts across the entire portfolio. So we talk about server and storage. We also have networking experts. We have experts who are skilled at the very basic component level, so hard disks in terms of destroking, how that affects performance, and those types of things. We have a very large ISO 9001 accredited facility in the UK, which we utilise to build both node and rack level solutions for most of our customers. So that gives us a lot of differentiation in terms of how we can take products, include hardware, software, networking, put it all together and deliver it into our customer site. So removing the complexity of having to plug and play all these solutions together. And obviously tailored support. One of the biggest challenges we found with large-scale cloud infrastructure is it's great that we have these options available to us today from Supermicro, from Intel, from all of these amazing white box vendors, but how do we support that? It's a big challenge for lots of our customers. So we've got a mature support business which today has around 4,500 on-site maintenance contracts for white box servers. So we're able to offer very, very tailored and flexible options to allow you to do that. So we like to think of ourselves as a trusted advisor. So we thought we'd get up here today and tell you some experience we've got in these markets, why you should listen to what we're saying, and hopefully we're able to resonate with quite a lot of the issues that you may have seen yourselves. So in terms of opportunity, what do we see in terms of hardware and software innovation? What opportunities are driving for everybody in this room? Software-defined adoption is obviously accelerating. We've seen that through some of the growth in revenue numbers of OpenStack and related services that we've talked about this morning. Network function virtualization. So if any of you guys are lucky enough to deal with the telco industry, you'll know that the challenge around deploying NFV services is significant. And obviously security. We've seen that. We've seen the security market has had a big change, a big shift away from proprietary hardware into software-defined. So we see there's something new coming into this open source environments that maybe we've not had the challenge of supporting before. AI and deep learning. So I think in the first keynote this morning we discussed TensorFlow. We've also got Caffe, ResNet, all of these open frameworks that are available to us, and it creates a huge need, a huge demand for high-performance compute capacity. Whether that's on CPU, Intel with their OpenVINO toolkits, whether that's NVIDIA driving some innovation with their GPU technologies, and obviously we're seeing new things like FPGAs from Xilinx and from Intel. Resource allocation. We're seeing customers deploying resources in a much different way to what we had probably 3 or 4 years ago. Moving resources to edge locations to be closer to the data creation, to be closer to the inference in terms of AI, and building those deployments of high availability with a relatively reduced footprint in comparison to our traditional DC infrastructures, a huge challenge, but it presents us with a great opportunity. And probably the one that resonates most with everybody is composable infrastructure. So we're talking about automating disaggregated resources in a data center instead of deploying individual nodes to run specific applications. We're deploying one set of infrastructure that we can dynamically reprovision at different sizes, at different performance levels to run specific applications. So that's a big opportunity for all of us. We're going to talk in a while about how the vendors themselves, so we've got 2 different perspectives here, from a hardware vendor, from a software vendor, how they're working together across the industry to make that a much more simple process. So to give you a bit of context about Hammer, about the type of work we do, the types of customers we deal with today, we thought we'd run through a couple of case studies and try and keep them quite relevant to the audience that's here today. So I'm going to run through 2 of these case studies. Both of them are cloud-type workloads. Both of them run OpenStack today. And both of them have had significant challenges in changing their approach to hardware deployment. So the first customer, based out here in the Nordics, big cloud service provider. Most of you will probably know who they are, but they're an open source super user, we'd say they're considered. They deal directly with Dell today, so in terms of customer-wise as a distributor, we have a challenge. They run a large virtualized environment with Ceph as a back-end block storage system. They also run bare metal as a service, provisioning via Ironic. High-performance block and object storage requirements. I think for any of you who've tried deploying Ceph, it's a challenge to drive performance. We've seen that these guys have looked to deploy it as a high-performance file system, doesn't work particularly well. So deploying block storage for a single-tenant customer is a relatively okay use case, but it still presents a challenge. And budget restraints. So we've seen more and more in the enterprise world, we're seeing data growing quicker than it ever has before. Unfortunately, the budgets are not growing with it. So we're getting challenges driving down the amount of spend we have. The requirement for storage and for performance is higher. So how do we manage that? It's incredibly difficult. So they took this problem to Dell. Dell presented them with, here's a solution. It's an R740 or it's an R730, whatever it might have been then. It's all flash. It's great. So we know that flash drives much more performance than rotating disk, and it was based on SATA SSD. We decided to take a bit of a different tack. So we went, addressed the solution, looked at what they needed, what performance they tried to drive, and we decided that probably they'd be better off with an NVMe-based system. So they didn't think it would be possible. They're looking at their budget, looking at what Dell have given them as feedback and said, how do we deploy NVMe? That's impossible. We worked pretty closely with Intel, so pretty well-known vendor. They've got a bit of gravitas in the market. Said to them, look, this is the challenge we have. This is what we think we can deploy. Can you support us? They came along, gave us a platform. So look, why don't you take a look at this Wolf Pass? For any of you that haven't seen it, come and talk to one of us on our stand. We'll happily show you. Pretty basic 2U, 24-bay platform. So relatively similar to Dell's R640. It offers significant benefits. Obviously, that change from SATA, removing the SATA bus, changing it over to NVMe, gave us a massive increase in terms of random I/O. So delivering read IOPS probably 30% higher with a massive reduction in latency. So immediately we've managed to address that performance challenge day one. Cost, obviously we mentioned the budget. That's a big challenge here. We looked at the Dell cost because we're a Dell distributor ourselves. We understand how the pricing models work. We went and took a look at it and said, right, this is the kind of challenge we'd have if we're doing this with Dell. £380,000, which due to Brexit is about 380,000 euros now, I think. The Intel solution, identical CPU and RAM configuration, increase the level of storage, massive performance benefits we mentioned, 260,000. So we're talking, 30% reduction in cost, double the IOPS per watt. So in terms of deploying new solutions very quickly, we're able to help these types of customers that potentially have great benefits to direct relationships, potentially have great skill sets in terms of how they deploy products, but don't necessarily understand the complexities of component level choice and how that drives change in the architecture. So hopefully that gives you a good example of that. The second example is slightly different. This is a customer who invested heavily in open source already, based in the Netherlands, so not in this territory, but delivering storage as a service alongside their VPS offerings. They had a big challenge in that they had a customized Linux platform running ZFS underneath as the storage services, running on HP DL series infrastructure. So probably something that a lot of you guys in the room have seen, pretty standard deployment in terms of open source Linux. And their VPS offering was based on delivering SSDs as single block devices to virtual machines. They don't own or operate any data centers, so these guys have got the challenge that they co-locate. In terms of physical footprint, the Netherlands is one of the most challenging territories we have. The power per rack, the physical cost of space is significantly high. And aggressive competition. So I'm sure for those of you that own and operate your own services, the challenge from AWS, from Azure, is significant. We see customers moving workloads to them because we get told we can't compete on cost. So how are our customers looking to address change that allows them to do that? They got to reduce their TCO. Reduce the complexity of the management because obviously that's a huge cost overhead, and they have to reduce the physical cost of the infrastructure itself. So for low performance storage, we put in a supermicro-based box, a relatively high density storage platform with a single socket motherboard because we realized that the utilization of their CPU resource is relatively low. So we consolidated their nodes from by ratio 3. Immediately they're saving overnight in terms of the physical space they need to deploy their infrastructure. The VPS node, standard 224-bay like we talked about in the previous example. We did a lot of node level testing, looking at the differences between direct attached infrastructure to expander-based in terms of SAS. It's a very boring, long process to do that, but we did it on behalf of the customer and said, look, you can reduce the HBA count by 3 here, remove the complexity of managing additional failure elements. And dual vendor qualification. So one of the elements we have in terms of white box is flexibility to deploy Western Digital, Seagate, Toshiba, and give you the choice. So for this customer, we decided that the best thing to do would be to deploy 2 different options. Let's qualify 2, and it allowed them to review vendor pricing at the end of each quarter. Driving that competition allows them to keep the cost as low as possible. This customer stage got about 40 petabytes of disk-based storage and just over 30 petabytes of all flash. So the scale is relatively significant. That didn't address their challenge. They still had the challenge. They're still managing a proprietary Linux system. They're still running ZFS, which is a relatively old technology. Sorry, Steve. You can tell me more about that in a minute. So there's challenges around scale. Managing that level of infrastructure underneath a proprietary platform is difficult. 15% year-on-year growth and 30% across the respective platforms meant that they had different scale challenges in mind. That 40 petabytes was going to become 60 petabytes relatively quickly. So they decided they wanted to transition to some better supported technologies, more widely adopted thing. They still have the challenge of the rack power. We mentioned Amsterdam, we were looking at 7.5 kilowatts per rack or something. So we went for a 6 or 9 month consultation phase where we decided we were going to deploy Ceph. Obviously, looking at the OpenStack tools that are available to them, looking at the community support available around Ceph, it seemed like a pretty obvious option. Migrating some of the workload over to object stores instead of block, but obviously where they needed to remain, we could run both alongside each other in the same platform. So we were chosen to deliver that across both disk and all NVMe-based nodes. Warranty. So for those of you that deal in public sector, non-returnable warranty on disk drives, we implement it as standard for these types of customers. So in summary to that, we think there are some obvious areas where there's going to be big opportunities for all of us. The white box Nodium market share in terms of server is looking to grow beyond 55% by the end of 2021. So these types of products we're discussing, although there are complexities to it, have got a huge footprint already and is growing very, very quickly. Efficiency, where we're capped on power in these types of locations, making sure we're utilizing the resources we have available is incredibly key. And the white box vendors, so Supermicro, Intel, these guys are extremely innovative. They're bringing solutions to market earlier than anybody else. The emerging opportunities we mentioned in deep learning and things like that, they're well matched to those types of product sets. And Hammer as a business, we got a great level of understanding around the application level, around the hardware requirements, around the challenges that generally exist in deploying these types of technologies. So, we believe that it's a great opportunity for everybody to look at these types of technologies. But that being said, it brings a huge level of complexity in itself. Supermicro is a good example, and Manny, you'll talk about it in a minute. They've got probably 10,000 different SKUs. So the number of combinations of products we can build from that is extreme. So our customers are coming to us and saying the problem we have is that all of our resources are focused on building out our software platform. We don't want to be managing a complex deployment of hardware. We don't want to be looking at the best way to build these infrastructures because it will just take all our resource. So we're going to sit here and we're going to discuss today what the vendors are doing to simplify that. Obviously, we've talked about the services Hammer can deliver around that, but we're going to talk a bit about what the vendors are doing. So I'd like to welcome Manny Barth, the sales director of Supermicro, and Steve Umbehocker, who is the CEO and probably lead engineer, I'd say, Steve, at OSNexus. Used to be. And we're going to ask a few questions around some of the problems that we see exist. And hopefully the answers that we give will resonate really well. And I think if we don't run out of time, the plan is to open up the floor for any questions you might have around that. So I guess I'll start with you, Manny. In terms of Supermicro's platform design, how are you seeing that change to be more application specific?
So obviously we've got thousands of product on our range, which you talked about earlier. However, what we do is we're honing in on specific designs. So for Ceph, for example, we've brought out one new NVMe solutions, but we've also got the standard SATA platforms if you need additional storage and don't want to go down the NVMe route. And then we also look at Canonical, OSNexus, and bringing out platforms that are optimized to be able to run the software. So it's making sure that everything underneath is working and doing reference architecture design to make sure that the hardware is working for the software so you can run it stably and consistently. Which is great. Obviously, we mentioned the complexity. We have customers today that say, great, I love the idea of the hardware. How do I deploy it with Kubernetes? Yeah. So Supermicro are going away doing some work with vendors like Canonical to simplify the reference architectures, give you a platform to go and build against. So that's great. Yep. In terms of simplifying those platform designs, then, Manny, obviously we talked about the complexity of bringing all those products together. Yep. How is Supermicro simplifying the design and the upgrade paths and those types of things? So we've looked at different ways of doing that. So one is having the reference architecture, but it's also looking at future-proofing as well. So we're looking at the open source technology. So you're not having to upgrade everything all in one go. So we're looking at the disaggregated approach. So for example, if you just wanted to change the CPU or the hard drives, or you're looking at the power cooling, because that's very important in the data center, it's about how you can become more efficient. You're able to do that by not using the skyrocketing cost of replacing the whole server, but looking at specifics that we could be looking to optimize to get that to be working in that way. So obviously we see today that potentially there's not a need to upgrade both your compute and your storage cycles at the same time. Yep. So what Supermicro are essentially doing are bringing them as separate elements. So we can upgrade from SATA to NVMe without changing our CPU configuration. Yeah, exactly that. Okay. All your power supplies and not having to change your footprint in the data center as well, but actually making it more cost effective as we're going on, bringing out the new products. Brilliant. So, yeah. And obviously from your perspective, Steve, you're coming out from the other way. You're obviously a software vendor. You have this complexity with there are thousands of platforms available to you. How do you simplify that for your customers that are looking to deploy Ceph or ZFS? Yeah, we used to spend a lot of time in Visio drawing up all these configurations, and as you have that back and forth discussion to kind of narrow in on a design, it changes a lot, and so you end up wasting a lot of time. So we ended up building a tool that's on our website that has all the Supermicro equipment that is designed for those Ceph configurations and the cluster configurations, so that it's really easy with a slider bar to go and
set the usable capacity and set the use case and start to get a roughly correct Ceph configuration without having to spend a lot of time in it. So that's been super helpful for all the work that we do with the Exertis Hammer, and then customers love it too. So that's kind of, we had to build tools effectively.
Yeah, sure.
Just because ultimately that's one of the big fears that people have about the software-defined way of doing things, is that I buy the right thing to go solve the problem, right? At the end of the day, you don't want to have to deal with all that complexity, and so it's kind of, I look at it as our job as a vendor to make sure that's super simple. So yeah.
And then obviously that creates a different challenge. We talk about Supermicro being innovative. We talk about Intel bringing great technologies to the market. How do you deal with those new technologies when they come around? I mean, it's not like you can integrate them all immediately.
Yeah.
So how do you manage the complexity of delivering new technologies to customers?
Yeah, we're all geeks, so we just are so excited when we get something new, like testing out like the Optane memory and some of the dual-ported NVMe stuff that they have at Supermicro. So, but yeah, it goes into the lab, and then we start developing the software for it. But usually, it'll be in the lab, like the stuff that we did around persistent memory and shingle magnetic recording drives.
Yep.
All of that work is a lot of that work's done, but it actually won't be in customer sites for probably another 12 months or longer. Because what ultimately the business is about is reliability. You just want to make sure that people aren't having to deploy anything that hasn't gone through a really heavy test cycle and has gone through a sort of maturity before it goes out in the field. So yeah, there's a lot of R&D, but it's fun. Everybody's super excited when we get some new bit of kit, especially when it's like something super fast, like the NVMe servers and things like
Steve
that.
Steve is definitely a geek.
So, yeah.
Telling the truth. So obviously, Manny, another question for you. OSNext is a great example of a vendor that's built out heavily in terms of API-based tooling to deploy, to provision. How is Supermicro collaborating across the industry, or how are you seeing collaboration across the industry to manage those types of things at hardware level?
We collaborate with a lot of software vendors, but we're also collaborating with Redfish for the API. So we're actually on the board for them. It's about bringing out a unified management of the software and the systems all together. So we're very involved in making sure that we're setting the industry standards. So that's something that Supermicro do, because again, same as you guys, I guess, right? We're quite a nerdy company. Yeah. I mean, 60% of our workforce are engineers, and that's where all our focus and efforts come from, is about from the engineering side of things. So we get involved with a lot of things on that side of things. So Redfish being one of the typical examples that we're being part of the innovation for as well.
So a question for you then. So if we're collaborating across different hardware vendors across the industry, is there not a danger that everything becomes so commoditized there's no value in any of the specific vendor offerings? Yeah,
I think when you look at it from one point, it looks like it's commodity hardware, but I think everyone has to remember that there's a lot of testing and validation that has to be done, which what you talked about. Sometimes we're testing things for 12 months to make sure it's working and doing what it needs to do to deliver on the software side of things. So it may look like commodity on one hand, but however, we're making sure that commodity hardware, as we're perceiving it today, is working and delivers on what it needs. And it's not just a case of one box fits all. It's about looking in at the software and making sure we're optimizing it each and every step. So when the software is changing, we're also working in the background, making sure that our hardware is optimized to also be able to work and function and offer the stability and reliability that you need, so you're not seeing any lag on the hardware side of things.
Fantastic. And I guess, Steve, for you, that creates another challenge. You're qualifying all these great platforms on your tools.
Yeah.
How are you finding that it's allowing you to go and win more business because you've got those focused product sets?
Yeah, we do a really deep tie-in to the hardware, collecting information about power supplies and CPUs and temperature. When a drive goes bad, our software goes and activates the LEDs and correlates all those things that are happening in the software to the hardware side. And so we work really closely with the hardware vendors. We run into things, and then we give that feedback to them, and then they patch the firmware, and then we retest and all of that. And it's great working with companies like Supermicro, where we can have that rapport and get things sorted out quickly. And so yeah, there's a lot of work on the hardware side because the software defined, at least in my view, is sort of like you have to take responsibility for the whole thing and make it so that this is a turnkey stack, and you can't just go and deliver the software part and just punt on the software or on the hardware. It's like it's supposed to be something that's turnkey as a platform versus just like a file system technology.
Sure.
Yeah.
Brilliant. I mean, in terms of questions, that's probably it from me. I think we've talked a lot about some of the challenges that we're facing. We've talked a bit about how they're being addressed at vendor level, a bit about how we can add value at a distribution level. But obviously, that doesn't necessarily mean that it solves all the problems. So we'd like to open to the floor and see if there's any questions that you guys have about integrating these types of products into that type of infrastructure. We'd love to learn how you manage it today, how you overcome some of the challenges that both of these guys have talked about. So, I mean, if there's any questions, that would be great.
No.
Cool. Well, thank you all very much for your time. Really, really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.